Welcome to our ongoing series of Midrash as a psychological backstory to the Bible. This episode is entitled, If You Want to Understand the End of Days, Think Like an Ancient Egyptian in the Time of the Exodus. So this ancient source, the Midrash, is saying that there's an exact parallel between what happened in the Exodus story in the Bible and what will transpire at the end of days before the coming of the Messiah. So let's start with the psychological insight that the Midrash is giving us about the ancient Egyptian. So let's try to get into his head. Here he is. He's got slaves who are Israelites, and he feels no compunction about tormenting them all he wants. And the same is true with his father and his grandfather. The Israelites had been slaves for a long time. And all of a sudden, there's this powerful God that's clobbering their country with these 10 plagues. And these plagues are ruining the economy. They're killing the livestock. They're ruining the produce. And the message they're getting is that this powerful God has a special relationship with the Israelites and is trying to extract them from the most powerful empire in the world, Egypt. An empire that's based on a slave economy, unheard of. And so this Egyptian is very confused. So this ancient Egyptian has to absorb this very unusual message that these Israelites are actually something special, and there is a special bond between this powerful God, and this is something that they didn't see, because for them, they were just slaves, no different than them. So the Midrash is saying that the same is true at the end of time. At the end of time, there will be a knowledge in the world about the God of Israel and about the coming of the Messiah. And all of a sudden, it will become aware, the non-Jews will become aware that there is a special bond between the God of Israel and the Jewish people. And this will be very confusing to non-Jews, because they're going to look back and say, but wait a second, how could this be? The history of the Jewish people has been quite a lot of misery. You had the Crusades and the Inquisition, the expulsions and the blood libels, and right through to the Holocaust. How could that be that there's a special relationship? When Hitler marched into Poland, 3.3 million helpless Jews were now, fair game for Hitler. Is that what you call a special relationship? I don't get it. I'm confused. So what is, of course, the key to understanding that is to understand that there's, number one, an unbroken bond between the Jewish people and God. In other words, the Jewish people have strayed many times in their history away from God, but that covenant is still there, and God never strays from the Jewish people. And number two, whenever the Jewish people stray, it is precisely the most powerful nations in the world who God chooses to be his agents to get the Jews back in line. So what looks like as degradation and torment is actually a loving God trying to do course corrections to get the Jewish people back on the spiritual path that they're supposed to be. So if you don't understand those underlying principles, then of course, it's total confusion. And the same confusion was with the Egyptians as the end of days. And in fact, you could even look at the story of Purim. If you remember the story in the book of Esther, so there was a king who had this number 2 obsessively Jew-hating assistant named Haman, and he proposed genocide of all the Jews in the empire, which happened to be all the Jews in the world. And at first, the king and his advisor were saying, I'm not sure if I like this idea, because I look at history and I see there are times when the Jewish God is quite powerful, the Jewish people are powerful, and they beat other bigger nations than themselves. I don't know if I want to start up with this God. But Haman makes the classic mistake. He says, yeah, that was true. But if you look at recent history, the second temple was destroyed, and how could that be a powerful God? God can't be powerful if he allowed the second temple to be destroyed. So we can go ahead with our plans of genocide of the Jewish people. So again, he's falling in the same trap, not understanding that the destruction of the second temple was an example of God lovingly trying to get the Jewish people back on path by choosing the most powerful nations of the world to destroy his own temple and exile the Jews, and lots of misery and death along the way. But the long-term goal is that the Jews should return to the path that they're supposed to be on, because the bond is unbroken. So this is a psychological backstory to the end of days, and I hope it brings some clarity to Jewish history, which seems quite dark and foreboding, but it is all for a reason. It's all based on an unbroken relationship going all the way back to when Abraham discovered God, because it's actually Abraham who found God and discovered monotheism, and that's when the relationship started. And Abraham was actually told at that time that his descendants would go into some kind of a slavery situation, because God already determined that is something they needed to go through in order to formulate a nation. I hope you enjoyed this, and like and subscribe, and I very much look forward to your comments.